Hey, greetings, Earth and Space Explorers. Welcome to Doc Waller's Earth and Space Report for Friday, March 29, 2024. I'm your host, Bill Waller, an astronomer, science educator, and communicator coming to you on a blustery evening in my hometown of Rockport, Massachusetts. These Earth and Space reports are intended to engage and inform people like you who are curious about Earth as a planet, who care about our life-sustaining biosphere, and who wonder about the greater cosmos and all that it has fostered. Video recordings of these reports are archived on the Earth and Space Reports YouTube channel. They are also in regular rotation on KPAN's community access cable television channel hosted by 1623 Studios. I'm grateful for the continuing interest and support shown by Rockport educators and students, Cape Ann cultural colleagues, cohorts of the Gloucester Area Astronomy Club, sundry Earth and space scientists, educators and communicators around the world, far-flung friends, family, and other curious folk. Thank you for your active participation, comments, and general encouragements. For this episode, we will explore the mysteries of Earth after the emergence of humans, but before the establishment of the well-known civilizations of antiquity. Taking us on this journey through time is Dr. Mark Carlotto, who has been advancing the study of this most intriguing topic. Dr. Carlotto has more than 4 decades of experience in satellite imaging, remote sensing, image processing, and pattern recognition. He received a PhD in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University in 1981 and has written more than 100 technical papers and 9 books. Outside of his occupation as an engineer in the aerospace industry, his journey as an independent scientist has taken him to Mars and back, again in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the study of UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomena, and investigations into the origin of ancient sites throughout the world. Links to his research can be found at markcarlotto.com. In this evening's presentation, Mark will discuss Antediluvian Worlds, exploring the possibility of human civilizations before our own. So let's get going. The Zoom platform is all yours, Mark.
Okay, Bill, thank you. Let's see, I'll start sharing. Set up. How does that look?
Great.
Are we good? So in the 1990s, archaeology was kind of turned on its head when the discoveries in Turkey were made at Göbekli Tepe and subsequently other sites that suggested that human civilization was a lot older than we had previously thought. At the time, the statement was that all of our theories were wrong. It's time to basically start over again. And this is oftentimes in science, you run into an anomaly, and things having been relatively constant for a while suddenly are in a state of flux, and you're in search of a new theory. Despite this discovery, mainstream archaeology tends to dismiss and often ignore out-of-place artifacts. And this is typical in science. Scientists are guardians of the paradigm, and you tend to think in terms of a box. You draw a box around your universe, your way of thinking, and science is sort of set up to resist anomalies. You in order to get a new theory, you have to have a lot of evidence. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence in archaeology that suggests that we're not quite done yet. There's a lot of so-called out-of-place artifacts, structures, objects that are inconsistent with the technology thought to have existed at the time they were constructed. So I'm going to present a new hypothesis to explain some of these anomalies in a simple, but admittedly a difficult to accept way. And being an engineer, my approach has been always to sort of follow the data, see where the data leads. And so this is a data-based study that I've been involved in since since 2016. So about, what is that, going on 8 years now. And so over time, I've gathered more and more data, and so tonight I'm just going to kind of share with you sort of where I'm at now, and see what I'm interested. You guys are, I guess, mostly astronomers, so it'll be interesting to hear your take on this. So without further ado, the outline of the talk is I'll start off talking about methods for dating ancient sites based on astronomy and earth science both. And then we'll look at some ancient sites and how my approach has been to analyze them, which is based on their geometry, based on their alignment. And I'll present some results, and I'll show that there's actually quite a few sites that can't be explained, and I'll present basically a new hypothesis based on, I say, Hapgood's theory of crustal displacement. It's a theory that has not really received much recognition in the mainstream earth science community since it was introduced in the 1950s. But it's an interesting theory nonetheless, and we'll talk about that. Talk about some climate data in support of Hapgood's theory, because there isn't really any geoscience data to support it, just given the nature of the theory itself. Present some archaeological case studies, and we'll wrap up. So the title of all my slides is blocked by all these windows. That's what I think this says something like astronomical time machines. So, I mean, the sun is obviously a time machine. Besides warming our planet, its path tells us, what time of year it is. Its days are shortest and the path is lowest in the wintertime and highest in the summertime. And it rises furthest, north of east in the summer, and sets furthest north of west in the summer. And in the winter, the furthest south of east, and sets furthest south of west. And so it's sort of a natural way of telling the time, not only of the day by the height of the sun using a sundial, but also in terms of where it rises and sets on the horizon. And why can't I advance? Oh, there we go. Okay. So, sorry, I'm just, I'm a little distracted because I can't see anything because of all these windows, the screen sharing windows. Okay. Just move this. Yeah, it's weird. I can't see the titles of my slide. Anyway, this is
solar alignments.
Solar alignments. Okay, so Mystery Hill is up in New Hampshire. It's one of these sites that's very interesting. It's somewhat controversial. Some don't really believe it's an authentic site, but it's interesting nonetheless. You can see some clearly defined alignments. This is a summer solstice alignment. And other alignments that are famous, the Giza necropolis, pyramids are aligned to the cardinal directions with really uncanny accuracy. So that's an equinox alignment or cardinal direction alignment. We have Newgrange in the UK, which is aligned to the solstices. Karnak in Upper Egypt, similarly aligned to the solstices. And Ailstones in, I think it's Finland, aligned to the solstices as well. Lunar alignments, we don't tend to think of them as often. The moon is more mysterious. Its motion is not as well understood by most people. It operates in a cycle of 18.6 years. So it's sort of the same sort of behavior as the sun, but it takes the moon, 18.6 years to do what the sun does in 1 year. But examples of lunar alignments are Chaco Canyon in the southwest, the Temple of the Moon in Peru, and the Ziggurat of Ur in the Middle East and Mesopotamia. And these are alignments in what are called lunar standstill directions. So similar to solstices, the extreme north and south setting and rising positions of the moon over the lunar cycle. And we find sites that are aligned to the moon as well as to the sun. And these are just a few examples. A few years ago, Mary Ellen, who's on, hi, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen and I collaborated in a study where we looked at alignments at Poles Hill here in Gloucester. And there was some evidence that this was a site used by Native Americans, but we didn't know exactly when. There was some speculation, but based on the alignments of, well, in particular, two stones to the north and west, northwest and northeast of a central sighting stone, we're able to determine that the alignments were probably, if they're authentic, were probably established around between 2 and 3000 BC, based on where the sun rises on the first day of summer and sets on the first day of summer. And this was consistent with some theories on early settlement of, or early visitation of Cape Ann, seasonal visitation of Cape Ann by the native people. Permanent settlements came later, and the winter alignment, which is a winter sunrise alignment. I think I can use my, can you all see the cursor okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Was established later. In fact, more recently, in the early, it's thought to be pre-contact. So, before 1600 or so. So actually off this scale, because this is 0 AD BCE. So this was just an example of how you can use alignments and changes in Earth's obliquity to date sites. This is archaeoastronomy. So in 2020, I published a study, looked at 225 sites that were selected across the world. They were analyzed using Google Earth. And so it was a sort of an aerial archaeological study, no groundwork, no field work. What was discovered was that of the sites selected, 19% were aligned to the cardinal directions, 9 to solstices, 15 to lunar standstills, 5 to the geomagnetic pole at the time, assumed time of construction, 5 to other sites, and 4 to zenith passages, which is another type of solar alignment, and 1% to certain stars. But 42% were unexplained. Now, some of these sites that are unexplained are shown here. Baalbek in Jordan, or Lebanon, I should say, has some of the largest stones, largest quarried stones in the world. This one shown here is about 1,000 tons. Oye Tambo here has enormous megaliths weighing hundreds of tons as well. Machu Picchu is a well-known site. And Teotihuacan in north of Mexico City is another well-known site. These are enormous sites having enormous stone structures, and yet they're not aligned in directions that we can easily explain in terms of the sun and the moon, or in terms of any, I briefly mentioned some of these other criteria as well, which we'll discuss a bit as we go on. So understanding the location of a site you know, my attempt was to try to, by using the alignments of the site, to try to have some understanding of when the site was first established. It's well known that the geomagnetic pole moves, and it's moved quite a bit, as you can see here in this diagram recently. And so, you know, compasses have to be, declination tables have to be updated all the time. Now, this graphic shows changes in the pole over the last 10,000 years. And using this information, you can construct a model, and depending on your on the site latitude and longitude, you can basically determine the direction of geomagnetic north approximately. There's always local magnetic anomalies, but generally you can come up with a reasonable approximation. And in doing so, you can look at the alignments of sites with regard to magnetic north as well. So not just the sun, not just the moon, but, you know, this is sort of a way of using the Earth, if you will, as a time machine. And by this method, we can actually go and look at the alignments of pyramids in China. And it's interesting that there are quite a few tens of pyramids in China that appear to have been aligned to magnetic north at the time of construction. And this is pretty unique. You also find this in Southeast Asia, but you don't really find it in a lot of other places in the world. So the idea, after having done this study and found so many sites that were non-explainable, and you have to kind of understand, I have some a couple of books I've written, but I initially attempted to publish this in a journal, and they said, well, basically, you need to first sort of establish, you know, what the baseline is, that there's an anomaly. So I sort of don't always, you don't always do things in the natural order. So I sort of backed up from where I was, which is here looking at this other theory, and I did the study that I just, you know, basically talked about, in order to show that if you look at, you know, using traditional methods and models, you know, what can you explain using those methods and models? And it turns out that, just going back, that only about 42% of the sites that I looked at were explainable using any of these, using, you know, either the sun, the moon, or you know, a magnetic pole, or alignments to other sites. For example, there are many sites in Peru's Sacred Valley that seem to face Cusco, the Seques. And this is not unlike the Islamic alignments to Mecca. You find these sort of navels or places that ancients tended to orient sites to. So looking at all these models, all these different criteria, it's like 42%, a significant number, were not explainable. So that was sort of, so the, you know, the peer reviewers were like, okay, you need to do this study first. So having done this, having established there's an anomaly, okay, so now what's the theory? So, or the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is sort of where a Professor Charles Hapgood left off. He wrote a book in the 1950s, and he proposed the idea that shifts in the Earth's crust. So I'm not talking about polar wander in the sense that it's understood today, but more or less rapid, oftentimes perhaps catastrophic shifts of the crust would occur. And this is sort of analogous to, imagine the skin of an orange that now can slip over the orange itself. So what happens in effect is that the position of the pole, the geographic location of the pole, changes. So now it's in the Arctic, but Hapgood had proposed that prior to that, it had been in other locations. And these are some of Hapgood's proposed locations. So he believed that based on climate data, between 12 and 17,000 years ago, the pole had shifted from Hudson Bay to the current location in the Arctic. But before that, other data suggested that it was somewhere in the north of Scandinavia, 50, 55,000 years ago. And before that, it was even near actually in the Yukon territory between 75 and 80,000 years ago. And he presented climate evidence to support this. So his hypothesis was that ice ages and climate changes associated with ice ages weren't the result of just the Earth cooling or warming, but actually were caused by the result of different geographical regions being shifted into and out of the polar region. So, the book that I wrote was called Before Atlantis. So I call the Before Atlantis hypothesis is as follows. It assumes that the sites that are misaligned to north, the ones that we can't explain, were aligned to other terrestrial points of reference. In other words, to other geographical poles. And so the methodology to find these poles, actually, because Hapgood had come up with some poles, but it was based on climate data. So having alignments of sites at specific locations, you could actually use spherical geometry to triangulate and estimate pole positions even better. So having some candidate sites, I was able to go through and refine their locations. So I'll present that. But the sort of the idea that Hapgood had proposed was that as the crust shifts, as poles shift, or the crust displaces and poles shift, so too do climate zones. So there should be implications of this that you can test. He did some of that, and I have, with some colleagues, done additional work. And I have to say, there's a lot of threads here. To try to get through it all in 45 minutes coherently is a challenge. So I'm kind of cutting through. I'm not going to get into everything, but I'll talk a little. Hopefully we'll talk enough about everything so you can get an idea of how it kind of all fits together. But the key idea is that the alignments provide an estimate of when a site was first established, assuming that what exists today was built over and or around the original site, preserving its original layout and alignment. And this, if you've been to Rome, you know that there are old churches or churches built on older structures. There's something underneath everything in Rome. Even in New York City, you have things built on top of other things, and it's often advantageous to do it in such a way that you preserve the original. Use the roofs of the roofs and the tops of the previous structures as foundations for the later structures. So this is the idea that by looking at the alignment, we can get an estimate of what we can determine what pole it was aligned to, and hence by virtue of the dating of that pole using climate data, come up with an estimate of when the site was first established. So not what exists today necessarily, but what that was built on top of previously. So this was published in 2019, presented at a data fusion conference in Baltimore, and it basically was described the algorithm which used basically spherical trigonometry, spherical geometry, to say, okay, let's look at these sites, their location, we have their orientation, and we can solve for the spherical triangle, and we can do it for all possible pole locations, and we compute the error, and basically using I'm not going to get into it here, but the idea was to find, using a sort of the best fit criteria, where's the best location of the pole given all of these sites and their alignments. And in doing so, I was able to take Hapgood's original estimate for the North Pole at this location near Hudson Bay and refine it to this location. This is just a kind of a heat map showing all the evidence. And again, the details are in the paper. So using this method, was able to refine all of his poles. Here's his 3 original poles, and I came up with actually 4. One actually split his Norway pole into 2, one in the Norwegian Sea and one in Greenland. And we have one in the Bering Sea and one in Hudson Bay, very close to where he had first estimated its location to be. So I said that climate zones change with poles. So these are the current climate zones for the pole in the Arctic, which should look pretty familiar. So what does it look like if you ship the pole and put the pole in Hudson Bay? Well, it looks like this. It's kind of interesting. It puts a lot of North America in the polar zone. Those of us in Massachusetts would have been within the Arctic Circle. Well, it wouldn't have been called the Arctic Circle because it wasn't the Arctic, but it was centered in Hudson Bay. When the pole was previously in the Norwegian Sea, much of Northern Europe would have been in the polar zone. When it was in Greenland, not all that different from the way it is now, similar, because its location wasn't too far from the current pole. But now if we go and put it in the Bering Sea, this is very interesting. So the Bering Sea on the other side of the globe, as shown here, puts us at a much lower latitude. This is the subtropical. This is the equator, subtropical, and temperate and polar zones. And so notice that Europe, the UK would have been in the tropical region here, in the tropical zone. And the reason I say the UK is a study was actually done, had nothing to do with any of this, in 2001 by Courant and Jacobi, and they looked at basically fossils, bones in caves in Britain, and they dated them. So there are 5 caves here, and they found different fossils, different animals at different times, and that were dated. And this is thousands of years ago on this scale here. It's kind of jumbled. There's a lot of stuff here. But anyway, the most recent was horses and woolly mammoth, dated to be around about 20,000 years ago. And then further back, Arctic fox and reindeer. And then further back, bull and woolly mammoth. And further back, hippopotamus and spotted hyena. Which is, these are not animals that are roaming around London these days. These are tropical species. So what's interesting is this lot here plots the latitude. Oops. Sorry. Plots the latitude for the different poles. So this is the current pole. I think actually, that's right. Okay, this should be shifted over a little bit. Sorry, it should line up here. But anyway, this is the current latitude of these caves. When it was in Hudson Bay, it was shifted a little lower in latitude, much higher in latitude when the pole was in the Norwegian Sea. Recall that at this time, I said Northern Europe. Let me just go back and show you here with the pole in the Norwegian Sea, Northern Europe, the UK was in the polar zone. So this is kind of consistent with the dating of these different species, these different fossil remains in these bone caves. So these climate zones, as they change, these would be then consistent with these pole locations shown here. So again, I'm not going to get too much into this. This was work published a few years ago in the Journal of Scientific Exploration where I present more of the geoscience data and climate data to support this idea of the pole shifting. Again, my original interest was kind of in understanding the alignments of archaeological sites that didn't seem to be explainable. That's kind of where we got started. We were talking about, seems like what 10, 15 minutes ago, and now we've kind of got seemingly off track talking about climate data. But this is kind of what, this is sort of what you need in order to establish, well, is there any evidence to support this theory? Because the problem is that there really isn't any geoscience data, because these pole shifts that we're talking about are occurring at a frequency of tens of thousands of years. And this is not the kind of temporal resolution that a lot of the, that paleomagnetic data that's used for, a true polar wander and the, crustal, for continental drift and so forth. For that kind of data is much coarser resolution. It's like a 500,000, plus, it's like hundreds of thousands of years, or maybe like 500,000, plus or minus 500,000 years. So it doesn't have a temporal resolution. So, rather than say, okay, there's no evidence to support it one way or the other, the next best thing you can do is find sort of proxy and look at climate data. And so, so this is what we did here. So this is kind of how it lines up. And what I'm showing here are sea level changes over this period of time. And so the idea here is in the last glacial maximum, that's when the ice cap was greatest extent over North America. Where I live now was under, what, a mile of ice, something like that. All of a sudden, something happened to cause all that ice to melt. Well, the hypothesis is that what happened was that the crust shifted, and what was in the polar zone was moved into the temperate zone, causing the ice to melt. And so over the last 25,000 years, there's been 140 meter change in sea level, which is well documented, well known. And so the idea is that this has been, over the last 120,000 years, this has been a progressive cycle, progressive buildup of ice over this period, over the series of pole shifts, and that they're correlated with supervolcanic eruptions. And I'll talk about Toba in a minute, but there's been others as well. And they're also correlated with what are called geomagnetic excursions. Let me just ask, are you able to see the entire screen, or is it blocked by various windows?
It looks fine. It says proposed chronology.
Okay, so I'm at a disadvantage because I'm like seeing like only about a third of my screen. I've got windows, all kinds of ash and trash blocking stuff everywhere. But anyway, I made the chart, so I should know what they say. But anyway, so the top line are the geomagnetic excursions. And again, I'm not going to talk about it, but I propose some mechanisms that link geomagnetic excursions with pole shifts that are some ideas that they're different from the ones Hapgood presented back in the 50s. But anyway, jumping ahead, how are we doing for time? 7:40, okay. So jumping ahead, I've continued to collect data. The original study, I'm gonna just zoom back, was I think I said it was 225 sites. So at this point, I've got about well, I've looked at over 1,000, and some of those are still unexplainable. But these are the stats for what I have currently. 344 of the sites that I've looked at have alignments to the current pole in the Arctic. 222 have alignments that reference the Hudson Bay pole. 67 reference the Norwegian Sea pole. 119 reference the Greenland pole, and 81 reference the Bering Sea pole. And this is the breakout by geographical region. And the reason I do this is I talked about the Toba eruption. This was a huge I think it was like a VEI-9 eruption. It was one of the largest eruptions on the planet, for I don't know what the time frame is, but it was huge and it was super disruptive. And what's interesting in this chronology is it occurs just at the time, and in fact, there's a hypothesis discussed in this paper that there's a linkage between this eruption, or the eruption was a byproduct or result of the crustal displacement event that took place. And so it was between the time of the Greenland pole and the Norwegian Sea pole. So if we go and look at, this is the relative frequency of site alignments to different poles versus different locations. So these are, again, here I'm looking at all these different regions here, and I'm plotting for the different, for each pole, the number or the relative frequency of alignments. So you can get an idea sort of the trends and how they kind of stack up. The reason I separate these two is that the ones on the right have a fairly linear trend going through this period of time. So if you take the average of the site counts at the Hudson Bay and the Greenland, and then subtract what was at the Norwegian Sea, you get sort of an indication of the deviation. If it's a linear trend, there's very little deviation. But if there was a discrepancy, as you see here, in these places, it goes way down. I should note. Let me note that there's a general trend here from as you go from older to newer sites or poles, that there's more sites. So there's more sites aligned to the current pole than to the previous, and so forth. And this is sort of to be expected, as well, for a number of reasons. But there's a big drop here at this point in time, and which is again here. And so if you plot the sort of the deviation from this linear trend here, it's kind of interesting that this is the deviation here, and it's greatest for sites more or less that are closer to Sumatra, to Southeast Asia. The ones that are furthest away, South America, sites here, experience more of a linear trend in site count frequencies. So I don't know the significance, but my attempt is to try to use a data-based approach to do this analysis. So rather than doing a lot of hand waving, and any claims, as probably you all know, if you've watched any shows where they're talking about previous civilizations, there's a lot of hand waving, but it doesn't necessarily have to disqualify the hypothesis. It could still be a valid hypothesis, and it's just basically how you approach it. And so my attempt is to try to use data, use analytical methods, and objective criteria. So where it all leads, who knows at this point. But some interesting case studies that I'll leave you with. The Parthenon, the Acropolis in Athens. Famous, if Plato talks about a lot of things in Timaeus and Critias, not just Atlantis, but he also talks about what Greece was like at that time, which is perhaps some indication of what Europe was like, at that point in time. Anyway, he talks about the Acropolis was not as it is now, and he talks about not only what happened then, but that the fact that there was this extraordinary inundation, but it wasn't the only one. It was a third before the great destruction of Deucalion, which is thought to have been the biblical flood, the last flood, the flood that swallowed up Atlantis, according to mythology. Interestingly, Mary Beard, in her book The Parthenon, talks about the fact that the Parthenon was not the first monument, but it had been built over a pre-existing structure, an earlier platform. partially finished temple, the same scale of the later as the later Parthenon. In Mexico City, Tenochtitlan is a temple that, like so many other temples in pyramids and other structures in Mexico, are sort of like Russian nesting dolls built over earlier structures. But what's interesting is that this is the alignment of this particular, this is the alignment of Mexico City, a large part of Mexico City. It's not cardinally aligned. It's aligned in the direction of the Greenland pole. Avini talks about this idea that modern cities tend to be built over sites of earlier settlements, again, often preserving the original alignments for convenience of construction. So basically taking these mechanisms or behaviors that have been observed and sort of applying them and interpreting them in a slightly different way. Rome, the Pantheon and surrounding area are aligned to major lunar standstills. I should mention that a lot of Rome and a lot of cities in Europe are actually aligned to the moon. I didn't get into this, but quite a few, but the majority of sites, if you look at the number of sites that are aligned to solstices versus lunar standstills, you would think that solstices are much more popular. People know what those are, but hardly anyone knows what a lunar standstill is. But it turns out that more sites are aligned to lunar standstills than solstices. And in Rome, the Pantheon is aligned not to lunar standstills relative to the current pole, but to the relative to the Hudson Bay pole. Because again, as the pole shifts, so too does do the astronomical alignments, because they're all relative to the geographical pole. And the interesting thing is that the moon is not currently visible through the oculus. If you've ever been to the Pantheon, you look up and there's a hole in the ceiling. But if the pole were in Hudson Bay, the path of the pole, the path of the moon during a lunar standstill, during this extreme motion, would take it over the oculus, but it would not be visible in that way today. The labyrinth at Harara in Egypt is there's actually very little is known about this. I got interested in this in the last couple of years. One of the things I do is analyze synthetic aperture radar imagery, and there's a lot of SAR imagery now that's becoming available through the European Space Agency. And I found some data sets over Harara in the Fayum. This is south and west of like Cairo, west of the Nile. And there appears to be evidence for an underground structure, which is something that Herodotus talks about. He first reported on the labyrinth in the 5th century BCE. Sir Flinders Petrie did a survey in the 19th century. There was nothing really left above ground, just some ruins. And there's no way of excavating at that time underground. And it's been, the Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to do any excavation there. But it's interesting, there's a clearly indicated a geometrical structure, and this structure is aligned to the Greenland pole, which suggests, based on our chronology, that looking at these dates, something aligned to the Greenland pole would have been built over this period of time between 75 and 120,000 years ago. And again, that was that would be the age of the first Parthenon, the establishment of structures on the Acropolis in Greece. I'll just mention that many of the ruins, many of the sites in the Sacred Valley in Peru are aligned to the Bering Sea pole, which suggests that they're in excess of 120,000 years old. And I mentioned the Pantheon in Rome suggests that those were established during the time of the Hudson Bay pole, between 25 and 40,000 plus years ago. So I started off. I'm sorry. things aren't linear, you know? And so I started off by saying, what did I say? That I'm proposing a new hypothesis that can explain these anomalies. So the anomaly is that so many sites, hundreds of sites, are not aligned in any meaningful way. But when you allow the North Pole to be in different positions or other positions, it explains the majority of those sites. So it's a very simple explanation, which is really great in science, right? You want, if you can come up with a simple explanation that explains a lot of things, that's a good hypothesis, a good theory. So I apologize having to go back and forth like this. So if you were to talk to if you guys were earth scientists, and maybe some of you are, you know, you probably like, you know, like getting really angry and everything. It's like, you know, this is impossible. We all know, you know, the way the earth works. It's everything happens slowly and blah blah blah. But the fact is, you got a lot of data that seems to suggest something else is going on. And so, you know, I love you know, watching lawyer shows, because so many times it's the circumstantial evidence that really nails it, right? And in this case, you know, you got 222 sites that appear to represent to reference this Hudson Bay pole. I actually go into the statistics in some papers, and I can give you some references. But there's so many alignments that it's statistically I don't want to say impossible, but it's like practically impossible for this to have occurred at random. So when you so after you have eliminated all of which is impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And so I leave it with that. These are the books I've written. This is Before Atlantis. I published this in 2018, which lays out sort of the basic elements of this hypothesis. And Beyond Atlantis, I published a couple of years ago, that actually goes through all of these sites in all the different parts of the world and examines them in sort of a cultural context in terms of what we know about these places and their histories or their prehistories. And that's about it. How we do it. So it's almost 8 o'clock.
I think we're doing fine.
I went a little long. I apologize.
Well, we have time. So if you
I'm
could
gonna stop. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Perfect.
Okay.
And I'm going to get the gallery up, and if you could all unmute, so I don't have to do it, that would be great. And feel free to unmute. I could do the work too. So we have a question from Bill Wall from the get-go, coming from Vancouver.
Yeah, hi. Interesting stuff. I think it's what you're talking about there is very exciting indeed. The problem is I don't really understand how the physics of this would work. One thing that the physics would be tied to or constrained by is the timescales of which the poles are shifting. Looking at your figures there, they shift from one position to another over tens of thousands of years. But I don't, is it supposed to be like a continuous movement, or is there a sudden shift? And if it's sudden, how sudden is sudden? I mean, how many, are you talking about hundreds of years, thousands of years? And then there's a question of other physical evidence too, so.
Right. Right. So, you know, I put this stuff out there, and you know the way it is that a lot of people read your papers, but there's no citations because no one wants, they don't want to touch it. It's like, you know, poison. I was hoping early on that earth science, you know, geoscientists and others would become interested and become engaged and bring to bear their expertise. That wasn't happening. So I wrote this paper. I mentioned it. I published it a couple of years ago in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, where what I do is I'm an engineer, and you know, I'm not formally trained as a scientist, but this is, you know, super interdisciplinary, and you got to get into a lot of disciplines. But you know, when you got a PhD, it kind of teaches you how to learn and how to figure this stuff out. So what I've attempted to do is kind of come up with sort of first principles, sort of rough back of the envelope hypotheses. So in regards to your question, Hapgood he suggested that it was the buildup of polar ice that caused an imbalance in Earth's moments of inertia that caused the whole crust to shift. Now, there's evidence like on Mars, the Tharsis volcano got so large that the Martian poles actually have shifted because of the weight of Tharsis, the buildup of that shield volcano, right? This was like billions of years ago, but there's evidence that that happened. So, I mean, Hapgood's proposal was something similar based on ice, but it wasn't that the whole, basically he proposed that it was a buildup of ice. Einstein actually looked at his theory and he said, probably there's not enough torque to cause that to happen. So,
I mean, you have an idea of timescales? I mean, how fast does it actually shift over that?
Well, so the original conjecture was that it was catastrophic, and that these pole shifts were the reality behind the myths of floods and cataclysms on Earth. I have an interest. I believe that sort of mythology is. I sort of see myth and legends as maybe being the breadcrumbs that lead us into some new directions, but you really need science to, they have to. The data's got to, the proof's got to be in the science. So anyway, the point is that these shifts were relatively sudden, not thousands of years, or perhaps tens of years, perhaps even less than that. But where it led me was, no one was coming up with any other alternative theory. And the more I thought about it, and I was going on these shows and people were talking about space weather and geomagnetic excursions, and you just get into all these other fields, and you start learning about what other things are going on at this time. And it seemed like there was a pattern emerging, that there were correlated events, and I showed that in one of the figures, the supravolcanic eruptions and the geomagnetic excursion. So sort of a long-winded answer to your question, the proposal, what I lay out in this paper, is that what happens during a geomagnetic excursion, not like a reversal is more of a long-term, hundreds of millions of years. An excursion is more of a short-term, either weakening or sometimes a temporary reversal of the poles. And my proposal is that when these occur, and these have occurred several times over the last 100,000 years, that when the geomagnetic poles reverse, the ferromagnetism of the crust ends up being in opposition, relative to the core field. And so my proposal is that the crust may become unlocked from the mantle. And under these conditions, I propose the possibility that Earth, Sun, Moon tidal forces could, over a period of time, act to pull the crust in much the same way that, look at the oceans, look at the tides. There's an amazing amount of energy there. And that over a period of time, if the crust were to become unlocked, the torque of the moon in particular would cause a shift in the crust. And what I show in this paper is that it appears that movements that are within the zone of the tropics, because this is, you can't just pull the crust, the moon can't pull the crust anywhere, but it has to act in certain directions, would be consistent with with these pole shifts.
Yeah, I think the celestial bodies with their tidal forces is probably not a crazy idea, but I'm not so sure the magnetic fields will make much of a difference, because the magnetic field of the Earth is not really that strong.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, it's I'm taking it so far, and I don't have the expertise. I don't know that I don't have a physical model for that. People actually, there was a professor up in Canada that did a model for what the effect of a grazing impact of a large asteroid, how that could affect, cause the crustal displacement. And there actually is, if it's big enough, it could cause some shift. but you know, that's not actually the mechanism I'm talking about here, because it seems to seems to be some periodicity to it. So I don't know. I'm still open. I'm still searching. I'm still thinking about it, and this is kind of just where I'm at right now.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your question.
Mario.
Yeah, I'm curious about your mentioning of the Roman Parthenon as aligned to the Hudson Bay. I find that one particularly hard to believe, and the reason is we have records, and we know that the sun shines through the circle on the top to a door, not the main entrance that people use, but off
Yeah.
to the left when you walk in, so that the emperor could come in. I believe it was summer solstice, or
Yeah.
I can't remember which one, but to light him up with the sun's disk.
Yeah.
And we have records that it was built intentionally that way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
at least on that one, I do not believe it could have possibly have been related to the Hudson Bay pole.
Yeah, I've read that too, and you know what happens a lot of times is that later, and there's evidence for this, that later cultures co-opt, you know, pre-existing structures, and use them in different ways. There's a lot of these sites exist in Greece, and there was a theory for the longest time that a lot of temples in Greece were aligned to the sunrise on the birthday of the deity that they were built in honor of, and this goes for the Parthenon as well, as well as many other temples. And it's been shown that that hypothesis is wrong. There's no support for it, and so it's sort of like you can always, I think, where human beings are really good at, well, we need to find order in things. When there's a mystery, you have to figure it out, and something is not explainable. You find some way of, you know, making the data fit, or you find some explanation. And so we're really good at it. So I mean, perhaps this is what I'm doing right now. But my point is that I think you can look at things in a lot of different ways, you know, including the Pantheon. But it's an interesting coincidence that if the pole were in Hudson Bay, the path of the moon at a major standstill would have taken it over the oculus. I mean, it's an interesting. I mean, it's something. It's not a matter whether you believe it or not. It's a matter of, well, it's a physical model. You can construct it and you can test it for yourself. It's either true or it's not. If it's true, it's kind of interesting. That's really all I'm saying.
Well,
And I'm
thank you for
saying
your
there's a lot
talk.
of interesting. There's a lot
Thank
of
you for your
interesting
talk.
coincidences.
Thank you
Okay.
for your talk, but I have to run now because I got to uncover my C-14 in the backyard here in Naples and take an image of a galaxy cluster. So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mario.
Thanks for your question.
So yeah, it seems like it's kind of hard to figure out what to do next. The alignments are there and they're fascinating, and that they do suggest nodes where places on the crust had shifted to become where the pole is, because the pole doesn't move that much with, you know, the obliquity of the tilt of the Earth
Yeah.
only moves by
Right.
2 degrees either way from the
Right.
23.5 degrees that it is at now.
Mhm.
So if this is going to happen, it's got to, you know, you got to blame it on the crust. And
Well, that's it. There's just so many degrees of freedom in astronomical explanations. It's like, okay, if there's, and you know, and Bill, what often happens is archaeologists will say, well, there's some local context. There's like some custom that they just wanted to build it in this direction for some reason.
mhm.
Those lead you, though. The problem with that is it's hard to test them in any kind of scientifically rigorous or consistent way, because they tend to be very ad hoc. And so that's why, you're looking at at more of a physical model is advantageous, which
Yeah.
is what I did.
And right now, the average shifting of the continents amounts to a centimeter a year. And
Yeah.
what you're asking for is 1,000 kilometers in about 60,000 years to go from one pole to the other. And that's a factor of
Well,
6,000 to 10,000 times faster.
Well, the thing, but there's a difference. Okay, geoscientists, what you're talking about here, continental drift is a very slow process. That's the movement of the plates relative to each other.
Mhm.
What this is talking about is the whole
Oh, the whole
configuration, everything's slipping like that.
Wow.
So it's a different degree of freedom, but how could it possibly happen? How would the
Yeah.
crust become decoupled from the mantle? That's the hard sell.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
But it's a great topic, and you've done a great job following the evidence. And if there aren't any
Well,
other questions, last call.
Well, I put a couple of
I'm
questions.
great. I'm great. It's great. I didn't lose everybody. A few hung on.
Phil.
I put a couple of questions into the chat.
Oh, should I check that?
These are, well, I can read them, I guess. So one is a rule out, and actually, I think Michael Deneen got to it before I did. He just asked what's anomalous so anomalous about unaligned sites, and my question was, are these sites really aligned to something? What if alignment to external points simply wasn't an objective of some or many of the original builders at the unexplained 42% of sites?
Yeah. Right. That's a good question. So it's hard to test that directly, but a way of testing it indirectly is you assume, well, they were aligned purposefully, and if so, do they all point to the same thing? So and that's the basis of my argument, that if they all point to the same thing, or four different things, if all these hundreds of sites point to four different things in essence, then for that to happen accidentally is very improbable.
Mhm.
I mean, so I can't really test the other hypothesis, Phil, that you suggest, that there was no purpose in aligning them, that they were just sort of random. It's believed actually a lot of temples in India were not purposefully aligned, but but I use the word, it is believed.
There is a way to test that.
Well, so certainly you find
Yes, there
the
is.
patterns, right? By if you make that assumption, then you're gonna find these patterns. But it is something that would, and I don't know how you would get the data to rule in or rule out the intent.
What you can do is you can have a simulation. What you do is you have a simulated Earth, or you have simulated sites on it, and you intentionally make them random. And then you see if you actually get the poles in certain places that in any meaningful way, right?
Yeah,
Or do you get so few sites aligned with each pole that that's clearly random? So if you can distinguish between random and what's actually on Earth to a high level of confidence, then you have a good case.
Yeah, is it signal or noise, basically, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I have some free time out, I will do that next. That's a very good suggestion. Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Easy to do, actually. Very easy to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and that would be a fascinating thing, because again, then you can sort of determine what the statistical noise is, and is this signal about noise. The other question that I had was, so we're talking about shifts in the location of the celestial poles that happen on the order of 10 Ks of years, right? So if we're saying that the putative dates of original building at these sites date to the location of the poles or the North Pole in those different locations, how does that correlate with known migrations? Who were the people there? what do we know of migration of Homo sapiens and also hominin species, Neanderthals and perhaps others, who could have been the builders 60,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, you know, at the various locations that you can, you know, posit the celestial pole being. That's
Sure.
another
Okay, so
line of.
sure, I can give you a short answer. So in Europe, okay. Actually, I can give you two answers. According to this model, the North America was under an ice cap during the last ice, when the pole was in Hudson Bay, 20,000, 25,000 years
One of my
ago.
favorite xkcd.com comic strips is when Randall Munro does the skyline of New York and Boston and so on, and then a mile above it, there's the surface of the glacier.
Yeah. So there are no sites in this part of the world aligned to that pole. Actually, to anything, because I think the glaciers probably scoured the surface of all those features. It was pretty disruptive, cleansing. It was a dissolution in the biblical sense. And similarly in Europe, there are no sites in Europe above the southern Mediterranean, central and northern
when the
Europe
north would have been glaciated. Yeah.
To the Norwegian sea pole. There's no sites aligned to that. So it's so the sites where they exist in their time frame is consistent with this model. It's also consistent roughly with migratory patterns that that would which is the Hudson Bay pole shift to the Arctic is totally consistent with the opening up the migration from Asia into North America over the Beringia.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking more along the lines of migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa. When did that occur? What was the sort of the time span of flourishing of Neanderthals? Were there other hominins that we don't necessarily know about that might have had the capability of doing any of this? Do we get to that point with any of these species?
I haven't. I know there's been they're discovering new human subspecies all the time, right? And I haven't. That's actually one area I haven't looked at, which is the correlation of that of those when they occurred and their migratory patterns and so forth with this. But that would be an interesting area for someone to pursue. That's a good question.
Well, I think our time is up, and I'm going to have to leave it at this. A lot of open questions. Hi, Larry. You can catch the recording.
Yeah, good. We're a little late. We want to see the recording. When do you post it? Right away?
I'm usually a day late.
Yes. Yep. That's what we see. Okay. Tomorrow we'll watch.
All right. So
Love you.
Thank you all, and especially Mark for giving us a very provocative and stimulating talk.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you. Thanks for your questions. They were great questions.
All right, Mark.
Okay. Take care, guys.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.